So at this moment of crisis, on the 26th of March, the French general, Foch, is made Supreme Allied Commander to try and stop the British and French armies from fighting two entirely separate wars on the Western Front. And on the 27th of March, General Gough, the commander in the Somme-Arras area, is sacked. Now, he deserved to be sacked by his failures in 1917 at Passchendaele and due to his poor performance in 1916. But as it happens, sacking him in 1918 was rather unfair. He'd actually fought a defensive battle on the Somme rather well. He'd fought badly in 1916, disastrously in 1917, and survived both times. In 1918, he'd actually performed pretty well, but gets sacked for it. But nonetheless, someone has to be blamed for the breaking of the British front lines, and he pays the price, although of course the real price is paid by the men on the front. On the 28th of March, the Germans launch another diversionary attack to try and draw away British strength from the Somme-Arras sector by attacking along the Lys with 9 divisions. But again, they are bloodily repelled in what will be a model defensive battle. All such northern attacks are now cancelled by Ludendorff. The Germans are still advancing on the Somme, but are slowing and slowing. And now Ludendorff changes the objective of the offensive yet again. No longer will he try and separate the British and French armies, now he'll try and capture the key railway junction of Amiens. On the 30th of March, the British and French armies are now, however, close to being pushed apart. The armies are joined at the village of Marieville, while on the 30th of March, the French army decide to abandon. Despite the fact that it is the critical join between the British and French armies, the French army pull back from the village. And just north of that village, there are some woods, and the German army entered the woods just north of this key village. It's an absolute crisis. General Haig sends the only force that is available to try and plug this gap. He sends the cavalry. The horses are half starved, so as the cavalry march to the front, the horses are still feeding on nosebags. Remember, they'd had real difficulty supplying the army itself for 1918. And so the British cavalry desperately try and get some calories into their horses to carry the cavalrymen, and the cavalrymen then get to the front line. They surround the woods and then dismount to attack the woods with machine guns and rifles, but they can't push the Germans out of these critical woods. The Germans then try and reinforce these woods with an extra battalion, realising that now is a critical moment of the battle. Catching the British cavalry by surprise. The British cavalry find Germans in the woods before them. Germans come in from behind, with no time to repair any kind of defensive battle. There are no trench lines here. This is a war in the open and a war of manoeuvre. With no time to repair defensive lines, the cavalry have no choice. They get back onto their horses, they draw swords, and they charge across the open fields towards the German infantry. The German infantry scatter in confusion and terror, with heavy losses as the cavalry start to ride down the fleeing German infantry. The German advance onto this gap between the two lines is halted, but the advance on Amiens continues. But now the critical moment whether the British and French might become separated has, for now, passed. On the 5th of April, the BEF finally managed to halt the German advance 10 miles short of Amiens at Villers-Bretonneux. It's the Sherwood Foresters, the local Nottingham regiment, that are fighting the last of the key defensive battles before Amiens. The Germans try yet another diversionary attack in the north, but it's a failure. Operation Michael is over. The Germans had lost a staggering 250,000 casualties, but they had advanced 40 miles. But the British and French armies had not been driven apart. If the Germans had succeeded, they could well have won the war, but they had failed. With British forces, however, now concentrated around Amiens, Ludendorff believes that a northern offensive now could break through, capture the Channel ports, and cut the British Expeditionary Force away from its supply lines if they could first just seize the critical railway junction of Hazebrouck. And so the German attacks will continue, but now in the north, where surely the British must now be weakened by the losses that they have sustained. And so the second German offensive is Operation Georgette, known as the Battle of the Lys. On the 9th of April, the attack begins, and as bad luck has it for the Allies, the attack hits the Portuguese army. Now, Portugal had entered the First World War due to its ancient alliance with Britain. The alliance between the British and the Portuguese is the oldest alliance still going in history. Britain and Portugal have been allied for now some 700 years. As it happens, Portugal does offer to join Britain's side in the Second World War as well, despite the fact that Portugal was ruled by a fascist dictatorship. It would have meant that there had been fascists on both sides of the Second World War. But even though this offer was made after France had surrendered, the British in the Second World War will refuse Portugal's kind offer of entry into the Second World War. You might say, why, when Britain's alone, do they refuse the Portuguese enter the war? The British know that if Portugal enters the war, Spain will enter the war, and Spain will seize Gibraltar, cutting off our supply lines to the Mediterranean and our quick route to Egypt, to India, to Australia, to New Zealand. And so Portugal's told that if they really want to help in the Second World War, leave it, stay out. Thank you very much for your offer. But even so, they do give us bases that are useful in the anti-submarine war. But in the First World War, they had got involved, and they had sent an expeditionary force to the Western Front. It was incredibly badly equipped and badly trained, and largely forgotten by the people of Portugal then and tragically now. As an aside, it is one of the saddest sights I've ever seen. As you know, I go to many First World War battle sites and cemeteries. Myself and my colleague, Mr. Stevens, we went to see the Portuguese cemetery. It was overgrown, unlike all the other First World War cemeteries. It was clear that no one visited it. At first I thought the gates were locked, but it turned out that the hinges had just rusted through, so we had to force the gates open. And all of these men died fighting against Operation Georgette, and they fought, as we're going to see, heroically. Few now, it seems, in Portugal remember their army. It even fought in the First World War, and they now seem to get few visitors. So if you get a chance, do go and try and see the Portuguese war cemetery. These men deserve, as we're going to see, deserve to be remembered. Now, they had spent years in the Western Front, just digging trenches, fetching and carrying. They were badly equipped with whatever equipment nobody else wanted, and they were not really considered a front-line army. Say, fetch and carry, boys. But in this moment of crisis, they'd been put into the front line, but they'd been put into what was believed to be a quiet part of the front. The Germans had not attacked this area, at least not successfully, for some time, and so it was believed that the Portuguese could hold this line so British troops could be withdrawn to send elsewhere. The Germans didn't know that this had happened, otherwise they would definitely have attacked this area, but by sheer bad luck, as so often happens in the First World War, the attack is going to go at a place where the line is weak. And so the Portuguese, they're poorly led, they're badly armed, but my word, they fight bravely. They were shoved back by this German offensive 3.5 miles before British troops could be rushed to help. The Germans take Armentières, and the British are forced to abandon Messines Ridge that they'd taken so spectacularly in 1917. It again seems a moment of crisis. And if you go to these Portuguese grave sites, you'll notice that all these men died in the space of 3 days. 3 days of furious fighting, when they could have broken and ran and cost us the war. But instead, despite the fact that they were forgotten at home, these men stood, they fought, and they died, but played a critical role in defeating the German attacks of 1918. But it seems once again that the Western Front is in a moment of crisis. On the 11th of April, General Haig orders that every position now is to be held to the last man, to the last bullet, in a rare emotional appeal. But the German advance is still trying to hammer through along the Lys. But as the British fight stubbornly, the German advance slows and then is halted.